For the same households, we collected data after they adopted microfinance. And suppose this data shows us that household assets went down. Well, was this reduction, this drop in assets, was this caused by microfinance? Perhaps, but perhaps not. There could also have been a recession at the same time, a flood, a drought, or something else that we might not even observe. So the data would not be conclusive. So instead of this time series approach, we might consider a cross-sectional approach. So now, compare households that adopted microfinance to households that did not. And suppose we see that the adopters, maybe surprisingly, have lower assets than the non-adopters do. So does this mean that microfinance hurt the adopters? Again, maybe not. Maybe the adopters had lower assets to begin with. Or maybe there was something about the adopters where their assets would have fallen even if they had not adopted microfinance. So there's all these potential confounding issues with each of these approaches. And this is where experiments can be really useful. Take a population of interest, randomly assign microfinance to half of them. This is called the treatment group. Deny microfinance to the other half, and that's called the control group. Now, randomization will ensure that the treatment and control groups were similar to begin with, or they were close enough on average. So now, if we observe a divergence in the fortunes of microfinance adopters and non-adopters, we know that this is the effect of microfinance. So the great thing about RCTs is that this identification problem is solved to a large extent. We are able to pin down the effect of microfinance. This is in fact what Banerjee and Duflo did along with co-authors Glenister and Kinnan using an experiment in the Indian city of Hyderabad. Banerjee, Duflo, and their co-authors have addressed a really wide range of questions using the experimental method. Some examples: what is the effect of deworming programs on educational attainment? How do you deter corruption in public works projects? How do you incentivize parents to send their kids to school? And how do you incentivize teachers to show up to school? And in fact, Subha might have some more to tell us about some of these things as well. So now let me start to conclude with a list of observations. 1, the fact that the identification problem is solved does not mean that the results are going to be clean. We see this in the microfinance experiment that I just mentioned. In fact, a point of these experiments is to engage seriously with some of the subtle differences between treatment and control groups. These subtle differences can often feed new rounds of theoretical investigation. So I said something about my theoretical work earlier. A lot of my theoretical work tries to explain why strange and counterintuitive things might happen in informal banking. And this theoretical work that I've done is directly motivated by a lot of experimental work that documents some of these strange phenomena. 2, RCTs are political. The starting point for a lot of this work is an acknowledgement of market failure. So this is the recognition that free markets cannot be relied upon to deliver poverty reduction or even efficiency. So the results of RCTs directly feed into public policy. What should be subsidized? What services does the market need to provide, etc. 3, sometimes experiments don't need to be conducted by researchers. The world provides the randomization necessary in a number of cases. For example, if we want to learn about the effect of class size on school performance, or the effect of women in politics. 4, the fieldwork associated with RCTs has value beyond the papers that are produced. For a while, I would regularly visit the island of Timor in eastern Indonesia. And my base was the provincial capital, Kupang, from where I was conducting a lot of fieldwork. And Kupang is a city that's so modest that my hotel had clocks showing the times in every major city, but not Kupang. Crisscrossing the island, chatting with people, I learned a lot that would never make it directly into my papers. So to give you one example, one day I took a taxi for a meeting with a local university professor. Now, I was working with the professor in her living room, And suddenly on the couch next to me, I found my taxi driver drinking tea. Turns out that he had been invited in to relax while he waited for me to get done with my meeting. Now, this is a seemingly trivial anecdote, but I feel it's somehow important to social science. Why is it that this would probably not have happened in my native India? Could such social norms play a role in long-term economic development? Maybe these kinds of things become clearer over time as one does more fieldwork. Finally, as one would expect, there are many critiques of the RCT method and its proponents. So some prominent critics are Angus Deaton, Land Pritchett, Sanjay Reddy, and Deirdre McCloskey. Jonathan makes some important points in a recent paper, which I hope he will speak more about, especially exploratory RCTs, which I have tended to ignore. I expect we're going to touch on a number of the following points as we proceed through our conversation. The first one is external validity. What assumptions must we make when we ask whether the same experiment on a different population would have similar results? Internal validity. By focusing on the average effect, are we obscuring important variation within the population that is being studied? Then, RCTs tell us about the marginal effects of the policy that we're trying to study. But in the real world, most policies are bundles of things. They're cumulative. So how much are these experiments going to teach us about what to expect from the interactions of multiple interventions? Next, what are the ethical issues around denying service to some people when you're offering it to others? Next, the big questions sometimes get lost, and this is something that is pointed out even by people who are generally very sympathetic to RCTs. For example, take one of the very big questions. Why are some countries rich and other countries poor? Are we diverting our attention from questions like that when we spend too much time conducting RCTs? And finally, there is an argument that's also made quite often that RCTs are used to validate what are common sense conclusions in economics, that the questions are not as big as they ought to be. Unlike, for example, in medicine, where one could say that the stakes are very clear and in some cases higher. So we can continue to discuss these. But for now, I'm going to leave you with one clear mistake that Banerjee and Duflo make in their recent book, which has just been released. I haven't read it yet, but apparently they refer to Elinor Ostrom as the only female Nobel laureate in economics. That, thankfully, is now untrue. So now I will pass the mic to the three speakers. You are free to go in any order. If you wish to go alphabetical, that's good too.
Stick with the economics convention. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Karna, and others at the Public Policy Institute for organizing this event. As a development economist, I'm of course very excited and have been ever since the announcement of the Nobel Prize this year. And also as someone who's been running RCT for close to almost a little over 10 years now. And my thoughts on what works, how it works, the potential benefits, limitations, have everything also evolved over time. I would like to start by saying that RCT is just one of the tools I use in research, and I think this is really important, especially if there are PhD students in the room, to understand that often there's been a remark that RCT is the gold standard, it's the best one for causal inference, and so on. I think those sentences are unconditional. I think it's very important to realize that the researchers who are running an RCT to answer their policy questions are most likely doing it because they've thought about that this is conditional on the question that they're asking. That's not a statement by itself. So it's based on the research question. You next ask yourself, okay, what's the best data set to do this? Should I look for administrative data? Should I look for panel data? Should I be looking to run an RCT? But I think especially for PhD students, I think it comes across as, okay, let's just go and randomize things. But that's really not true. People who are running this are thinking about this is the best method given the research questions that they're asking. Second, I would say that whatever I'm going to talk about today on RCT is that my experience on RCT is largely drawn from my work in India, a little bit in Sierra Leone, and also Azerbaijan. My work is also drawn largely my experiments in education and health that have to do with children or young adults. Let me start with the benefits. It's always exciting to talk about the gains first before we start talking about all the limitations that I've learned over the course of running RCTs. As a young PhD student, I was absolutely in the awe of idea of running RCTs and thought this was so fascinating to try and doing something like this in the field would be an enormous learning experience as well, both academic, but also in terms of just learning how to make real world connections and how to have something that goes beyond an academic publication to have a real world impact. And but over time, you also understand all the limitations that come with it, and there's nothing like perfect. There's nothing called perfect methodology either. One of the best things about randomized controlled trials, I think, even today, given all its limitations, is that its ability to deliver causal inference, that we are able to say whether there's an impact, causal impact of an intervention. We are able to either reject the null or do not reject the null. We're able to say either way, yes, something works, or no, too bad, this didn't work. And so thinking back, why were RCTs welcomed? Often people talk about everything was randomized, and it seems like so many things were randomized suddenly in the last 10 years. Why weren't they randomized 30 years ago? People were doing policy work. Why didn't we think of randomizing so many things 20 years ago? The point is that monitoring and evaluation has always, after having conversations with many government organizations, NGOs, and some of my partners include Pratham, whom you've been familiar because Asaduflo and Abhijit Banerjee's work has a lot been with Pratham, Catholic Relief Services who do a lot of important development work in many developing countries, and the World Bank and state governments, is that monitoring and evaluation has always been a critical component of anybody who's doing policy work. They've never let go of the idea of monitoring and evaluation. They've collected lots of data. Even if you speak to people at Pratham, they'll say they've always done monitoring evaluation ever since they started the organization, except that people didn't do randomized controlled trial as a method for monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring and evaluation has always existed. People spend tons of money, organizations spend tons of money doing pre and post analysis or doing simple mean comparisons, but they never had standard errors, they said. They never computed standard errors before that to say whether their impact estimates worked or not. So I think it's not that researchers just went in and decided that let's go in and randomize everything. I think it was more of the beginning was, let's substitute existing monitoring and evaluation methods with a better research methodology, especially if you're collecting your own primary data, if you want to examine the impact of an intervention that is only being run by Pratham, like let's say you can take Abhijit Banerjee or Asaduflo's Balsaki program that they examined, or the vocational education experiment that I ran with Pratham that we looked at in New Delhi. The point was that instead of using old archaic methods of monitoring and evaluation, you're just substituting those resources to do with a better research methodology. That's on the high point. And that's similarly my experience even with Catholic Relief Services. When we were talking about them interested in, they've already been involved in early childhood development programs for many years. And they've been involved in ECD programs in many countries doing relief work as part of their relief work. These are people who can make serious changes in the lives of kids and adults around the world. And you realize they have a new parenting program that they want to integrate into their current nutritional program. They already have 20 or 30 clusters where they want to target the program. They think about examining the impact of the program using their existing methods and assessment. Then they decide, after they've looked at and they've read the newspaper articles or all the RCT work that's happening around the world, people are becoming a little bit more open, I would say, NGOs. And they're asking researchers to partner with them and say, hey, this is what we want to do. Is there a better way to do this? They would have equally spent the same amount of money collecting the data, except not arriving at the kind of scientific conclusions that most academic researchers or policymakers would have been comfortable accepting. So I think that has been my journey with, let's say, understanding with both Pratham and with Catholic Relief Services, in that mostly it's been a substitution of existing resources towards a better research methodology. That said, I also have to say that, of course, RCTs also come with a whole bunch of challenges. I mean, challenges come both in terms of the critiques, the more serious critiques I'll talk about, but also in terms of implementing challenges. And I have to say that the partner has a very, very important and critical role when you're implementing a randomized controlled trial. There are a ton of field level logistic constraints. It's a nightmare. You have to be on the phone with your partner. You have to make sure that things go according to plan. Otherwise, you don't know what results you're getting. You don't even know what to infer from the results that you might be getting. That's unlike all the admin data work or panel data work that you do. You have nobody to blame. You just have some administrative person you can say, oh, he or she did not have extra data collected. Here, you're responsible. If things go wrong, you and your partner or somebody had not thought about the things. That's why there was a miss in terms of the quality of data that was collected, or attrition rates were higher, or some process-based mistakes. I also want to say that there are two sort of big challenges. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot more as the course of the evening. But as Karna said, that what are sort of the major critiques of randomized controlled trials? One of them is, of course, is the external validity or scale-up challenge. Even in my own personal experience, once we ran the experiment on returns to vocational education for low-income women from New Delhi, we found that the returns were great, fantastic. And it made sense because take-up of the program was high. We could understand from both even qualitative data that we collected, group discussions that we held, and all the objective measures that we collected, the story lined up that yes, returns were high and it made sense. People were actually having the skills, made these women get into self-employment. They were interested in vocational education. Having the skills allowed them to participate in the labor force and increase part-time wages for them, and sort of and self-employment, but not sort of serious full-time wages, which would be, again, the best thing that labor economists would want. That said, if somebody was to ask me, would this result hold if you were to scale this program up all over India? Then I think that's a tough question, and I don't think I have a good answer for that. And that's because as you cross borders in a country like India, there's not only does the cuisine change, the language changes, the cultural and social barriers to working and labor changes. For instance, especially if you go to the southern part of India, the cultural barriers are not so high to women's labor force participation, but there are huge income constraints and caste barriers that would refrain women from taking certain types of occupations. At the same time, in the northern part of India, you may have both huge number of caste barriers as well as social barriers, where women are it's just not acceptable for the women of the household to go out and seek employment. So even knowing what the results may be in New Delhi and at a certain random, even with knowing causal impacts, I don't think I feel confident to say what will happen if this were to be scaled up all over India. The second challenge among the many limitations is also about, let's say, general equilibrium effects. And especially in a program like this, when you think about increasing labor market participation and employment, you're increasing labor force participation. If, let's say, people were to scale this up, we go to the government and the government says, yay, vocational education is fantastic, let's scale this program up, let's provide low-cost vocational education and access to women all over India, because labor force participation among women is really low right now in India, and a big policy question as well. And one of the constraints is, if there is an excess increase in labor supply, what happens to wages? The general equilibrium effect would be that if there's an excess supply of labor, then wages would go down. And in which case, what happens to the net effect? Do the program benefits really outweigh the costs that accompany that? There's also a potential challenge that as you scale up, take-up is a big concern in RCT. At the outset, it seems very simple to run an experiment, just to randomize two groups and compare the averages, and you'll get the impact. But there's a lot of hard science goes beyond in carefully planning and articulating a well-designed experiment to make sure there's no contamination, to understand what are the constraints to take up. Because if it happens to be the case that you have really low take-up of your intervention, you will be in a point where there is a null result, but what is worse is that you will not be able to say anything conclusive about your null result. It's not just that you have a null result or no impact, which is fine, that is also learning. And a lot of times, as Duflo says, that even a null result is fine. We want to learn what happens, whether it works or not. But the worst is when you're in a position where you can say nothing. All you can say is that this impact evaluation cannot draw any conclusive evidence. And that is also a possibility. But when you have people involved, you have NGOs, donors, funders, government organization, and after having spent $500,000, is this the kind of answer that would be acceptable to anybody or most people? Those are sort of tough questions. I don't think we have answers to them today or anytime soon, but these are all the things that we need to constantly ask ourselves as we do more RCTs or policy experimentation. I'm sure I spoke for 10 minutes.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to celebrate this Nobel Prize to Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer. On reflecting on what this is about, it's more than about these three people. They've really helped change the way that economists, the way maybe social scientists and agencies, people interested in development, people interested in changing the world and making it a better place, really help change the way that we approach knowledge, learning, experimentation, and that's been a major shift. For those of you who haven't been paying attention to economics for the last few decades, it's really gone from a field that was very theoretical and very sort of particular in how it approached empirical questions to one that is extremely empirical, where people are always going off these days and collecting their own data and asking questions, and often it's not enough to write down a model, but the question is always, well, what does the data say? And that's a real change. This Nobel Prize this year is a reflection of that transformation, not just of randomized control trials, but of the field more generally, as it's become more empirical and has thus opened up to a whole series of new questions that economists weren't asking before. And even theory. Karna was talking about some of his theory, which is an important part of this conversation, but even theory has become kind of more empirically inflected, and the assumptions are changing. I think Karna is really in the forefront of incorporating new behavioral assumptions into theory, making theory more empirically relevant as we go forward. So this RCT Nobel Prize, the Nobel Prize for its pioneers of RCTs, is really capturing an important moment. It's not just an important moment for economics, but it's also an important moment, I think, for accountability. I think what the Nobel Prize represents is a belief that if one's going to invest money, try to improve the world in whatever way possible, then there ought to be accountability to what's done. It's not enough just to write a check to charity or for the World Bank to give a loan to a country. There ought to be some follow-up. Did that check to charity work? Did it actually help people? Did it hurt people? What was the consequence? And RCTs are one way, not the only way, but one way to answer some of those questions and to create some accountability for people who often don't have a voice, don't have a way often to say, hey, this isn't enough. And I think it's opening up an important conversation that really transcends the methodologies. I want to talk a little bit about I think what's exciting or how to think about RCTs, and then following the examples of Karna and Suba, talk a little bit about some of the limitations. In my own work, I use RCTs. I do use other approaches as well. I think we're all kind of broad in the way we approach data, trying to fit the methodologies to the questions. So I want to start by just reflecting a little bit on causality, which economists are obsessed with trying to figure out what really caused an outcome. And it's a very powerful frame. And I think back on a study that was published in the American Economic Review recently on the Illinois Workplace Wellness Program. So this was a study across Illinois where different workplaces, like Hunter, might introduce programs for their employees and try to encourage them to get to the gym and to eat better and to do all those things. And so the study was organized as a randomized control trial. But in writing up the study, they also looked at just the kinds of evidence that one would usually look at if one didn't have an RCT. So they said, well, let's look at the people who took advantage of these new workplace initiatives. And we'll then look at people who didn't. And it turned out that the people who took advantage of these initiatives, they were more likely to go to the gym, they were more likely to stay in their jobs, they were 3 times more likely to have run a 10K race in the last year. And it looked like from that kind of evidence, comparing the people who really took advantage of these programs to those who didn't, that this was a great success and that ought to be replicated. But then the researchers, they took advantage of the RCT. So it turned out that some employers were randomly chosen and given incentives to adopt these programs, and some didn't. So instead of looking at people who took advantage, people within a workplace who took advantage of it or didn't, it looked at all of the workers at a site, a workplace that had the access to these programs versus those who didn't, randomly assigned. And it turned out that there really was very little impact. No difference in the number of 10K races that were run or the number of times people went to the gym. And as Subha was saying, that null result was a very powerful result. And it suggested that a lot of what we see happening in the world are strong correlations, and maybe the people who take advantage of these programs enjoy them and benefit from them. But the fact that they're changing behavior is much, much less clear. And that's the same thing Karna was talking about microfinance, right? Which is something I've worked a lot on over the years, and I know others in the audience, and Karna's contributed some real insights. It's a very powerful story, microfinance, right? Muhammad Yunus, starting in the 70s in Bangladesh, had this keen insight that poor women especially were being held back for lack of simple loans, capital to grow their businesses. And he told a story that was very compelling and built a bank, Grameen Bank, which with Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. And it's led to a global movement. I think it's done a lot of good. And yet it wasn't quite clear whether it was like that Illinois workplace study, where the people who were borrowing just people who were already excited about small businesses and they were going to, advance and do well anyhow? Or was there something really powerful about getting those loans? And did it unlock productive potential? That was a question that was fundamental to understanding this movement, and that was very, very difficult to answer. And I'll come back to what I think we've learned about microfinance through RCTs, but that's the power of this movement, to try to answer those questions rigorously for the first time. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I want to just say a few other broad things first. I think one of the reasons why this Nobel Prize also matters and why RCTs, I think, are spreading globally is that there's a realization that a lot of the challenges that are being faced in health, in education, in low-income communities, that for a long time they were really problems of access. People not getting access to primary schooling, people not getting access to doctors and medical care. What I think we're seeing, partly through RCTs, but partly through other evidence, is that we've been ignoring quality. The kids are going now, thanks to a lot of work, kids are now getting to primary school. But the teachers aren't necessarily showing up. Subha was telling me about a study that she's doing in Jharkhand in India, where teacher absenteeism is a big issue. Right? It's about quality. The early work of Michael Kramer was on textbooks and blackboards. In medical settings, there's similar issues. Are the medical staff trained? Is there water? Are there hygienic facilities? The Lancet recently did a study, it came out last year, that said of 8.6 million deaths which are preventable every year, 8.6 million deaths, 5 million of them, so most of them, are due to issues of quality rather than access. So access still matters, but quality matters increasingly. and is responsible for most of the preventable deaths. And that's where RCTs can really make a difference. Because RCTs are really a way to say, well, what if we train doctors in a different way? Or as Suba's experiment, I don't want to tell you the story of your work, but it's exciting. It's saying, can we find ways to give incentives to teachers to show up more, right? And does that then have impacts on kids? That's the power of RCTs. They're not world-changing questions necessarily, but in the lives of families and communities, they can make a big difference. So, access and quality. Another thing I just want to reflect on is a lot of the coverage of RCTs has been about finally answering questions about impact. Did something matter or not? Did those Illinois programs work or not? My sense is that actually a lot of the interesting work that's going on in RCTs that has been opened up is not so much about did something work or not? Did microfinance work or not? They're questions about how can they work better? So a lot of the RCTs are in fact about, what if with microfinance, right? These are loans that are quite costly. They might cost 20% interest per year, or 25% or 30%. And what RCTs allow researchers to do in partnership with organizations is to test what would happen if you reduce interest rates? Or what would happen if you raise interest rates? And studies are showing, that actually customers are very sensitive to interest rates, which is something that experts hadn't imagined until the RCTs were done. And we're seeing lots of different innovations which are now happening. In microfinance, for example, one of the strange things about a microfinance loan is if you were given a loan from Grameen Bank, you'd be asked to start repaying that loan the next week. And then every week you would repay that loan for a year until it was paid off. And you might think, well, that's a bit strange for a business loan. Don't you think you'd give the borrowers a little bit of time to invest and kind of grow their businesses before they start repaying that loan? So some researchers working in India did just that. They did an RCT and they said, well, what if you give borrowers, say, 2 months to just start investing that loan? And it turned out that the borrowers did much better, made much higher profits, took more risks, for better and worse. But the RCTs opened up questions. I'm going to come back to, well, maybe I'll just say about some of the criticisms. Right? So in general, I think RCTs are a huge opening and help us start to ask a lot more interesting questions. But there are limits, and Karna and Suba have already put some on the table. I'm sure we'll have more. But from my perspective, a few of them are, one, we're looking at incremental changes for the most part. And that's a kind of a philosophical position. But for those who are inspired, say, by the Democratic primaries now, who are, see the need for big changes, big structural changes to make society better, RCTs and the kinds of changes that RCTs are looking at may be frustratingly small. The other thing is, as someone, we've all been doing RCTs in various ways, often one has to be opportunistic, right? If I'm interested in Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and I want to see the impact of Grameen Bank, I can't randomize it. It's been in existence for decades, right? So I have to look at places that are willing to randomize, say, moving into Karna was talking about an example of microfinance, moving into a city, opening up some new branches. And so one has to be opportunistic, look at places where one can possibly randomize the order of implementation, say. But that's not answering some fundamental questions. That study that Karna was describing can tell what would happen when that program moved into a city for the first time. But I actually, even if the study was done very well, it wouldn't tell you about the average impact of that entire program, and it wouldn't tell you about the average impact of microcredit in general. So we learn things, but they're particular things that are specific to the to the site. And the last thing I want to say is, as I hear a lot of criticism of RCTs, right? There's a lot of enthusiasm, there's also a fair amount of criticism, and criticism from some of the most important voices in economics, Angus Deaton, Jim Heckman. A lot of the criticism is about the claim to being a gold standard, right? The idea that evidence from RCTs is just better evidence, more reliable, and that other evidence is sort of second-class evidence. I think that's the challenge. The evidence from RCTs is not better evidence. I think the gold standard language is problematic, and I think that Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer would say, look, we're not comfortable with that language, we shouldn't use it, it's the wrong language. What we should do is embrace RCTs for what they are. They give us better estimates of things we hadn't really seen before. And they open up our knowledge and help us see new possibilities. The gold standard language is a problem because it shuts down possibilities, shuts down knowledge, and says that kind of knowledge should be ignored, or if it's not from an RCT, then it's not worth anything. And so I feel like if we can get beyond that language, we can have a richer conversation about possibilities and about some of the real constraints which limit what we're understanding. Thanks.
Hi. So it's wonderful to be back here. I can see a lot of my professors, Econ 101s, econometric professors. So it's great to be back. So I think my experience is slightly different from the one of Jonathan and Suba, because I haven't done academic RCT as a professor. I've been more or less a practitioner in the field. So I will speak more into some of the challenges and the organization I work with help with the whole movement. So just after Hunter College, I had a chance to work for IPA, Innovation for Poverty Actions, partly because of the support I had from various professors here. And so I got a chance to be part of the movement. This was back then in 2008. So just to put into perspective, I think IPA helped a lot with some of the implementation challenge that we're talking about here when it comes to external validity. So they've been replicating a lot of things in different countries. Because one thing will be to make sure that the design take into account when you're expanding an experiment and see how it will work in a different context. Another way will be to look at what work and just replicate in a different country and see when you have similar results. And IP have been able to do that. Somehow they've been doing around, since 2002, they've been doing about 800 evaluations around the world, over 50 countries. And I think the RCT movement has been really useful also in reducing the gap between policymakers and researchers, right? So it provides opportunity to leading academics to go into developing country and sit with not only practitioners but also beneficiaries, try to learn about their life, because poverty is not just numbers, it's just a way of life. And to design a good RCT, most of the time you have to be in the field, spend a lot of time with people to understand the challenge, because the design is not just all about this work or that, but most of the time also we are interested in seeing how things work. In order to know how things work, you have to get a better understanding of how people live, how the beneficiary live. You have to have a better understanding of some of the challenge around you. I think one of the great additions, or maybe the RCT movement help with, is also on data collections, right? So, when I think about these, I feel like I'm old now. It's been about 10 years when I was involved in the first survey. That was in Mali. And we had to use paper to do data collections, meaning that you go to the field and you interview households. And a lot of these surveys are long. It takes about 2 to 3, sometimes 4 hours to interview just one household, because the interview is usually about all the households members, but not only their consumption, but the productions, whether they involve in different things that can be used for potential confounders. Uh, and after paper data collections, then you go and enter data set, like, so then you can use. And these are huge. Like sometimes, like for instance, the first survey I work on was 6,000 households in 500 villages. And Jonathan was one of the PI in that project. So in terms of logistics in a developing country, this is quite difficult, right? So these are places where, villages, like the area is about like half of the size of Texas, right? So and villages are all over where you don't have a good roads, and you have to think about all the logistics. You have about 60 to 80 people in the fields. You have to think about how to organize them, how to collect data. So the RCT movement helped to create market for data collections, in the sense that it's helped how to do that better. Now, pretty much no one use paper questionnaire, and it helped a lot to improve the data quality, because before you have to have skip, right? So it's like, in a typical questionnaire, when the age of someone is less than 5, ask the marital status of the person. But now you can program that so you don't have those errors or the genders and things like that. So it helped a lot to improve data quality. And also it helped to develop systems that can help you to do back checks and go back to make sure, because one thing is to answer your questions, and another thing is to get the right answer for it. You will see things, for most of the data collections, like given the fact that you ask about consumptions and you ask about production, at the end of the day, things should be balanced, right? But you will see households where sometimes they consume a lot more than what they produce, and then there is no transfer, there is nothing else. So that means maybe something is wrong with how they do it. So then we develop a kind of backfill, how we call at IPA, meaning that after collecting data, then we set other team to go and re-interview a sample of the a subset of the sample, and then compare the result to the primary data collected. And then if there are errors, the margin is more than 5, the error is more than 5%, so then we go back and review those. So basically, I think even, this is really important for even applied research, right? Because data collection is the key. If you're not a RCT fan, so that means you will still be relying on this data set to do analysis. But like RCT contributed indirectly or directly to not only the availability of data set, but also improve the quality of data collections. I remember when I was doing my Hunter College thesis here, I did it in Mali. So basically, in the country, I had access to, maybe there was only one data set I could use. And the sample size was less than 300, and the data has so many issues in cleanings and a lot of things. But now, since IPA moved to Mali, we have about 3 times more data set, higher quality, larger sample data set. So I think that contribution is great. So I want to talk a bit about some of the critiques, but in a different way. So usually it's like some of the critique for about the whole RCT is about external validity. As I said in the opening, I feel like, that's definitely, you have some of, this could be a problem, but at the same time, there are solutions for it. one of the solutions that IPA does is to replicate experiments in different places. For instance, like a good example of that will be the graduation models, where there has been recent studies where they think of cash transfer is not enough, but like on top of cash transfer, you have to provide people with training and other things, like a package, right? So a holistic approach to solving some of the constraint. And they've done that in different countries, right? So, in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh, and that gives the opportunity to see what works in different places, in different contexts. And, some of, the other critiques about confounders and other things, I think that's applicable to any studies, like, and especially with IP and JPulse, they equip now people interested in our city with enough tools to think ahead of time, because they've learned by doing. They've done thousands of experiments throughout the world, and so we can mitigate some of these issues. And when it comes to critiques about those who should be getting are those who need the most. So it depends on the kind of experiment you're doing, because the assumption is to test what is good. So prior to doing the experiment, you don't know what is good. So that's applicable to some of the social experiments we do in the field. But in other cases where that's not clear, you definitely do something. For instance, like I work on an experiment in Kenya where we were trying, to find a way to mitigate the level of aflatoxin in blood. So meaning that, like, at the baseline, we had to test people, like control and treatment, and we had information about the level of aflatoxin in the blood. So automatically, anyone with a high level will send to hospitals. So, technically, it will decrease the chance of finding something like a big difference between treatment and control, but for ethical reason, we have to do something about it. You can't see that someone is sick and not to do something about it. So the experiment was more about reducing the level of aflatoxin by following people in the treatment group, providing them with the opportunity to swap their contaminated maize over time. But at the baseline level, so anyone tested with high level of aflatoxin were given something. And in addition to what Jonathan said about, what our city has been contributing to, I think, it's not just about what works and what doesn't, but RTC provide us a great tool to also test channels, like how things works. And I think that's really important, because one thing is you might know that something works, but you don't know how it works. If you know how things work, and that can help you not only with implementations, but also costs, because money is the key when it comes to development. So you want to put your money where you get the most out of it. So RTC can be combined with other methods to do that. So maybe the only critique I might have about RCT will be sometimes the cost, and the cost not, because it's costly, and that prevents sometimes young students or researchers to be able to do it. If this is the gold standard, now is more and more difficult to publish paper if you don't have clear identifications. And as a young researcher coming from grad school, how you gonna have access to money to do some of these things? And again, IPA is doing something about that also. They have grants that people can apply to, but I think if we have more money into that, I think that can help to give access to everyone.
Thank you very much to all of you. You all have a lot more experience than I do, but several things that you said resonated with me. Maybe I'll ask you a few questions that came up in my mind as you were speaking, and then we could open it up to the audience. So, Nahum, when you were talking about about the potential, just practical concerns associated with conducting interviews, for instance. One of the things that I was reminded of is how there was a lot of variation when I was conducting interviews in how distracted the respondents were. And I don't know much about this, but I mean, do you think that this is the kind of thing where maybe we should be doing RCTs of our interview methods and things like that? Because clearly those things matter a lot, and do we have a structured understanding of how they matter for good or bad data?
I definitely agree with you. At some point, I was actually even thinking about doing a study about this. I discussed this with Jonathan, not specifically about how distracted people could be, but sometimes the length of the questionnaire. Because I feel like, sometimes you have huge questionnaire. As a researcher, we are so greedy for everything, and then we always add more to the questionnaire. And at some point, you ended up asking questions, maybe the respondent might think that they don't know it. So if you ask them things, they think, they don't know it, so how they gonna make an effort to provide you good answer for things they know, because they will just think this is a guessing game, and then they will guess everything else in the data. So I think that's a legitimate point. Again, we have to strike a balance between what we want to do and the time of people and how to do it. And that's why IPA has been trying to do some kind of back checks, right? So because it's not just enough to answer questions, but also you need to, to go back and check some of them. And I think electronic data collection also help with a lot of these things, because you can have filter in your questionnaire and make sure that, like, if things don't add up, like, something will pop up, and then the interviewer can go back and make sure to correct some of these things. Before, we didn't have all of those. For instance, like if you're asking a respondent about household productions, right? They said we produce 100 kilogram of rice. But like if you go to the consumption part, and then the same person is said, out of productions, I consume 200 kilograms, right? So it could be possible, maybe they're left over from last year. So those are the things you can now do with electronic data collection. And another thing that electronic data collection really help with is high frequency survey. So actually, I was looking at a TED talk of Jonathan where he was talking about, poverty that is not measured only at a yearly basis, right? So these people live throughout the year. So with electronic data collection, now we can go and collect data set more frequently. That can help to minimize some of these errors. For instance, like there was a survey we did in Mali was 6,000, and then we selected a subset of the household we follow every 3 months for 2 years. So these can help to reduce some of the errors you can do in a normal data collection.
And one more thing for Subha and Jonathan, actually, because it's related to something that each of you mentioned. Subha, you were talking about just not having take-up as an issue, and Jonathan, when you were talking about Grameen Bank, there was this question about whether those who were taking up were actually benefiting from it, and that would have been a legitimate question. Now, what I want to know from both of you is what you make of the neoclassical benchmark, which is that if people take something up, then that's good. And if they don't, that's good too. And how should we be disciplining ourselves in designing questions where we don't trust this neoclassical benchmark, where the product at play might be one where people might not really know what's good for them, and so on. So because those might be the types of questions that are more ripe for experimental evaluation than others.
Okay. It's a good question and a tough one too, because I think, I don't think we can act as judges of whether take-up is the fact that they're not taking the program must be a bad thing. I think a lot of times that I have in my experience seen is that it's also due to poor implementation that take-up has not happened. So in an ideal world, new classical economics would fit in and where the implementation happened exactly as planned and still take-up did not occur. And then there is learning that, yes, this is not the way it works, this is now it was not supposed to be done. But if there's just an a process-based failure, then I think it's really hard. And I think a lot of times in the field, it's a process-based failure. And sometimes it's truly a learning that, well, there are other ways. Maybe we first need to understand what are the factors that impact take-ups. You need to estimate a demand curve in some sense. So you can go back to neoclassical theory in terms of thinking about what are the incentives or incentives that are required to first increase take-up on a program that is potentially enhancing. But again, it's sort of hard. Without take-up, you can't say anything about the program. And unless you have those impacts, what can you say about why should anybody take up the program? So it's sort of a difficult problem to handle.
Karna, you reminded me of one of Esther Duflo's, my favorite quotes from Esther. I think it was in the New Yorker, and it was exactly on this. And I remember her talking about microfinance and how everyone would say, oh, you don't need to do impact studies. You could just see if people take it up. And she described that as the idiotic market test. I thought, wow, something just happened in economics there. The idiotic market test. But yeah, I mean, that is, I think, a powerful thing that's going on here. Because RCTs surface these puzzles. You design this project you think is beautiful and it's really going to help people, and then nobody wants it. That's pretty humbling, but it's also a moment for learning and understanding. But it's also kind of a chance to think about what the real constraints of people are. Sometimes it's understanding, sometimes it's that the economists or the researchers totally clueless about what's going on. So just one quick example, there was a study of insurance take-up in Kenya. Livestock farmers facing a lot of risk of livestock death. And you'd think, wow, they should really take advantage of the insurance which was available, but only 5% were taking it up. And researchers asked, well, maybe it's because they're trying to sell the insurance at a time in the year when people don't have that much money. So they said, what if we sell it at the time when it's sort of harvest time, the farmers are flush with money. It's a kind of a weird time to sell the insurance, but maybe it'd work better. And take-up went from 5% up to about 70%. So it's a nice example of how RCTs are focusing us, maybe inadvertently, but focusing us on these questions, and I think it's opening up bigger understandings.
Thank you. So now, in the remaining time, I think we are happy to speak with the audience. Feel free to
I had a short comment and then a question. The comment is there's a philosopher who you may be familiar with whose name is Nancy Cartwright, who writes a lot about, so I think she's a good person to look at or read for the external validity stuff, I think. A lot of useful stuff to say. And then I had a question about external validity. It sounds like that's usually discussed in the context of a study that finds an effect for one population or in one setting, and then the question becomes, will the effect be found someplace else? Would you find it again? But I also wonder if there's enough attention to the fact that you might do a study where there is no effect, apparently, or there's a null effect, right? And that wouldn't mean necessarily, you wouldn't find an effect someplace else, right? And the worry is that if you find the null effect, you might end up saying, that doesn't work. And that could be that could be a problem, I think, right? Because it cuts both ways, I think.
I just really quickly, totally in agreement. And Nancy Cartwright's work has been very powerful. She's a philosopher of science at London School of Economics. And one of the things, though, she looks at this problem in a very specific way. So she asks, we saw that microfinance worked, for example, in a city in India, but would it work, in the countryside, or would it work in Kenya? She focuses on what's going on in the environment. And I think economists are guilty of not paying enough attention to context. She's saying, what are the conditions that led that program to work there? And I think that's an extremely important question. I think as we're going forward, we're starting to ask other kinds of questions, like, is there something specific about the population? Is there something specific about the design of that program? So kind of layering on top of the questions that you raised. But I do want to say, for the sake of completeness, say what the RCT defenders would always say, which is, this is a problem in all economics, right? So it's not specific to RCTs. It just becomes more focused in this context.
I just want to add something to that. I think there is this big issue that people, about external validity, and how do you go from, let's say, learning something from randomizing 200 villages. And there is a little bit of conversation around, and I even heard Esther Duflo talk a little bit about, now we're going to scale up to 2,000 villages. And Mushfiq Mubarak at Yale has a new program, Y-Rise, where he's now thinking about that we need to now randomize at very high, large samples. And I think it'll be nice to bring back to the Deaton and Nancy Cartwright's discussion, especially the conclusion where they talk about that what happens when you run in the medical literature. If we go back and think about the medical literature, then you're running a small scale RCT, and yes, it's for the average person. The impact is for the population that was studied, the sample. But who's really taking the impact of that medicine and telling you? It's the doctor, your physician. He is a very important intermediary who's making sense of the academic work that came out, of the impact of a certain medicine or the value, and then he's going to decide what the prescription is going to be. And that's where symptoms matter, right? And that's a little bit like context. So if you have your history, are you diabetic, are you acid reflux? And then that's what decides from the menu of choices of what medicine to give. And I think this is where I think we as academics, we know what the science is, but I think there has to be sort of an intermediary. We need policy practitioners as well. We need people who understand, who have PhDs, who have academic knowledge, to understand what the scientific gain is, but who also has insurmountable field level knowledge and presence to understand what to make of this and take it further. And I think a great example that comes to my mind when I've been thinking about all this is that Rukmini Banerjee at Pratham. She has a PhD to work at one side with Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee to think about the RCTs, to make sense of all the tables, the standard errors, the clustering issues, everything scientific about it, yet is empowered with deep field level knowledge of education in India to be able to say, what part of this RCT can I carefully take it to all over Pratham's program, whose presence is for 3 million or more kids in India, all over India, without having to worry about context. So I think this is hard. I don't know who those people are, who should be these policy practitioners, but I think a public policy institute is a good place to start thinking that maybe that is where these practitioners need to come about. But I don't think the solution is that let's go from spending $1 million to $20 million to answer whether something works or not, and then again come back with an answer. Oh, but then how to stop? There's no end to this. Because 2,000 villages may also mean nothing in a state like India. So.
Hi, thank you for coming. I had a question around ethics when it comes to RCTs. I think that it seems very intuitive to anyone not in the research field, the ethics of where the threshold when to perform an RCT is and when there's not. But when you look at something like the AIDS epidemic, when I think the medical community was very much trying to gather data on effectiveness of different medications, and there was a big, the feeling of those affected by the virus was that it's a terminal illness and something has to be done no matter what. So I think that the threshold of when an RCT is appropriate isn't as clear as possible, or clear as maybe intuition would lead you to believe. So I just wanted to hear if you could talk a little bit about the threshold, if there's certain questions that you ask when trying to decide if it's appropriate or if giving a treatment to the entire population is appropriate, and maybe I guess some of the experiences and best practices that you've seen in the field.
It's a great question, and I think it grapples anybody and everybody who has ever run a randomized controlled trial. I don't think they spend a lot of time thinking about this, whether it's okay to randomize, whether it's okay to leave a group. And I think in social policy experiments, it's okay to the extent that you really don't know whether it's working or not. You don't know the full consequences of it. And I've also realized, working with a lot of non-governmental organizations, it's really also about resource allocation. You have the money only to run this program in 20 villages, let's say, or 40 villages. Then the question is that if you didn't have a randomized controlled trial, how would they have gone about this? They would have selected 40 villages based on some prior knowledge and done it on, in fact, a more selective basis, but not that they would have scaled this up and given it to 80 villages. So all you're doing is now you're bringing you're bringing in structure by randomizing it. But at the same time, in fact, many times people have given the feedback that it's better that when you don't, it's a little bit of, when it's made of lottery rather than somebody in a powerful position deciding which villages should get something. It's much more fair in principle to a lottery to decide, than anything else to decide, especially if you're getting access to a program. Yeah, that's been one of things. But of course, certainly, you cannot randomize anything and everything, and one has to be very mindful about what they're getting involved in and think about the full gamut of possible unintended consequences as well.
So to add to that, I definitely think that there should be sometime lines, what to randomize and what not to randomize, depending on the means and what you can do. For instance, most of the RCT I've been involved in prior to working for IFPRI, in Kenya was most of this social stuff. Sometimes you don't know whether they work or not. So then, the notion of giving better to those in most need, because you don't even know whether they work or not. So that's one thing. But when I was working on medical experiments where we had to test the level of blood in people, the level of aflatoxin in people's blood, so we had to do something about it. So we, if anyone, no matter whether you are in control or treatment, we send you to hospital. And as Suba said also, is there are risks, right? Risk for elite capture, right? That's one thing. So randomization will somehow bring some kind of fairness when resources are limited. I remember, some of our data collection in village, when we went, we randomize the people who have to be interviewed prior to going to the village, and then we go and talk to the chief of the village and say we need to, interview these households. And in some villages, people resisted to it. They said they don't know how these people were selected. So what we decided to do is to randomize at the village in front of everyone, and then go, and those selected, because sometimes when you do this interview, you spend a lot of time with people and you bring them something in kind, like soap or something. So the fact that you go to a village with a list of things, they don't know where the list come from, and then you interview those people. So people feel less sense of fairness. But the fact that we randomized and people were happy with it.
I want to pick up on something that everyone sort of said, that we're realizing that the context matters. And as I like to say to students, when you see a result, it's not the result, it's a draw from the distribution of results. Now, I'm going to put Jonathan on the spot. As I read the journals, I see typically one article on an intervention. And then if I'm a good graduate student, what is the reward to me of being the third person to study flip charts in a different context? How do we change the incentives of the profession to make the replications as valuable as the originals?
I think the answer is you don't. I think replications need to be done, and I don't think it's necessarily the grad student who should be doing those replications. You know, grad students should be asking new questions if they can, right? Somebody should be doing replications, and maybe, you know, IPA or a professional organization should be set up to do that. And we shouldn't necessarily think it should have the same kind of academic rewards. The World Bank should support that, Gates Foundation, others, if we think there are important questions. But I do think academics can still have an important role in figuring out how to replicate. And right now I'm involved in a project, we're just starting, where we've got funding not just to do another, we did a study in Bangladesh about a mobile banking experiment, which was fairly successful, and the Gates Foundation said, hey, we'd like to fund you to replicate that. But the idea is not just another one of the same thing. We're really going to try to think about how do you replicate in a way that allows you to learn optimally. And that might mean doing really different things in different places. The field doesn't really have a great sense of actually how to make progress. And so as a scientific issue, that's something I would love grad students to get involved in.
I have two somewhat related questions. One is, how do you balance the role of being an implementer and being an evaluator? So if you are out there trying to get some intervention in the field, and then you're the same person or organization evaluating it, do you, are there any conflicts there? And related, many of you spoke about take-up and the challenges with take-up. Do you try and then increase take-up, or do you try and step back and say, we're putting the resources out there and we don't want to contaminate it by doing what we can to maximize take-up? Like, does that, do you put efforts into increasing take-up, or does that contaminate your experiment?
I have something small to say on this. It's a partial response, but this is something that I did grapple with in both in Indonesia and in India when we were conducting. These were sort of banking experiments, either in cash or in food, depending on the setting. And in each of these cases, our partner organizations, the ones implementing the research, they also had a stake in the results. So even though we were, my co-authors and my RAs and I, we were the evaluators, the partner organizations, they cared very much about what the results of the evaluation would be. So there was, in fact, a constant tussle. And I think it's, they had very legitimate concerns because they have certain objectives that need to be met and so on. And there was a constant tussle about how we prevent them from taking little steps that, in fact, encourage take-up too much, for instance, by modifying the product that they're offering. And in other cases where the implementing organization was, they didn't really care about our research project, we had to, in fact, intervene and change the way that the intermediate agents were being paid, because the implementing organization didn't care about changing the payment structure for the agents in such a way that the agents would actually implement what we wanted implemented at all. So just from a practical standpoint, I think it's important to recognize that even if the implementer and the evaluator are two different entities, there's going to be very specific interests on the part of the implementer, and it's something that you have to think about. You want to respect that, and you also want to be able to communicate to them that they might consider doing you the favor of letting go of some of the objectives for the sake of your research.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. You know, places like NGOs like IPA can help do this, because usually they are different than the implementers, although we work closely with them. So one of the things we do, we call blind treatment, in the sense that, for instance, like when we work with an NGO, they won't, like when we're doing data collections and things like that, they won't even bring their card to the field. Like, we don't want to see their logo or anything. If they, and even people collecting the data don't know exactly what is going to happen, because all of those can bias response. People can either respond questions to either avoid or be part of the treatment. I find it easier with NGO, usually because most of these evaluations are not imposed but encouraged by donors. So somehow, it's much easier to work with them. But like when you work with private sector, doing this is quite challenging. I remember doing something with a microfinance institutions. It was quite difficult. We ended up giving them something so that they can let us freely do what we were doing and wait 2 years until the end of the implementation so that they can expand their activity.
So I think one last question, maybe.
I don't know if I need that. So as an outsider to this literature, I guess I have one question. As a macroeconomist and as a student of history, it seems to me that the large movements out of poverty have been because of perhaps the Industrial Revolution or technology, say antibiotics or, whatever one might want to say. Historically, these have been the drivers out of poverty. And now we're talking about preventing absenteeism, deworming people, all very worthy things. But I guess I'm struck by, would anyone like to comment on what are the limitations on the kind of questions that you can ask with RCTs? And given the evidence from human history, where do you see the future of this? Do you see this as a central part of a movement to eradicate poverty? Sorry, I don't know, I wonder about it, that's all.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and maybe it's a good place for us to land. It's true, when we think about the incredible transformations globally, the eradication of extreme poverty throughout the world, it's India's rapid growth, it's China's rapid growth more than anything else, and human history has shown that. And so that's not a RCT question. But we've also seen that for decades in sub-Saharan Africa, where growth has been slow or even negative, that there have been improvements in education and health, right? And that's come through interventions, and well-designed interventions. And there are many times where growth happens, but not everyone's hooking in. Not everyone's able to take advantage of it. So it's really a question to me of sort of both. Can we design and think about interventions that help more people take advantage of the broader macroeconomic changes, at the same time thinking about interventions that can matter even when those macroeconomic changes are not happening at the pace that's hoped for.
I think it's true. I completely agree with whatever Jonathan said right now. And it's about the small micro changes. So even though India has grown, so for instance, the big macro factors that yes, India has grown rapidly, per capita incomes have risen over the last 10 years. But there is also equally grappling an unfortunate fact that 60% of kids in grade 5 in India cannot read a grade 3 level text. If it's really so much about economic growth, and we know even from macroeconomic factors that human capital is an important driver of that growth, then we really need to figure out small and big ways to change this learning deficiency. Can we just, and that's certainly not true about, especially both in the areas of chronic malnutrition and education. Income is not the driving force. We have evidence from like lots and lots of countries. In fact, a most recent RE-STAT paper also the other day I saw, there is nutritional deficiencies even from kids from middle income households. So there are small, important micro interventions that are absolutely necessary for improving human capital development, especially?
This is a bit of a response from out there, but David Abrams, who teaches at Penn Law School, his macro approach was to try and convince a Second Life, this online portal where you could have a second life, to conduct randomized experiments in monetary policy. So you could actually consider those big picture macro growth interventions from an experimental perspective as well. But I don't think they agreed to conduct those, really did. So he ended up running some pretty micro experiments, which were interesting anyway.
One little thing I just want to add is maybe, sometimes he might not give us enough evidence he might not help to know, to respond to those big questions, but at least he might help with inequality, right? Because a country can still be growing, but you will still have a huge part of the country lagging behind. So you can do some of these experiments, try to understand why and how some of the good things can help those people move along with the rest.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I think we can continue this conversation more casually. Upstairs.
How many floors upstairs?